All right, Shabbos, say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's shir. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Elul, Jerry and Sarah Wolaski, for dedicating all the Shuman Rashos this month in the Schus of Refuah Shalema for Zachariah Dov Ben Perel Shira. To thank the Tilson and Wall families of Eretz Yisrael for dedicating all the Shuman Rashos this month in honor of the wedding of our children and with best wishes for health and shalom and Ashana Tova Umesuka. To thank Avram and Shani Kalman from Eretz Yisrael for dedicating all the Shuman Drashos this month in memory of their beloved parents and in the schus of all those who need a refuah shalema. To thank Selma Wolf for dedicating all the Shuman Drashos this month. Oh, this went dark, sorry. With gratitude to Hashem and with tefillos for health in the new year. To our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Alan and Sumairitz, in memory of Alan's Bobby Henya Rachel Bas Shimshon, whose yahrzeit is the 21st of Elul. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama will have an aliyah and the family a nechama. But with that, let us begin. A lot to do today. So Baruch Hashem, today's Daf is Chaf Hey 25, and we are picking up on Chaf Daled Amud Beis 24b, 20 lines up from the bottom. So also, if you remember again, we ended off in yesterday's Daf with an interesting discussion between the distinction between causing damage directly to one's eved versus creating external stimuli which then result in damage. So the Gemara explained that when you cause external stimuli, like you make a loud noise outside of the eved, and as a result of the loud noise he becomes frightened, he becomes deaf, or he goes blind, halacha l'maaseh does not go free for that, right? He's not emancipated for that. Why? The Gemara's logic was that is the eved allowing himself to become frightened, as opposed to if I hit him in the eye or if I hit him in the ear, that is me causing direct damage. So the Gemara says 20 lines up from the bottom. Kiddushin hamavis es chavero pater medine adam v'chai b'dinei b'shamayim. What's the interesting case? If you scare someone, imagine for a moment you frighten someone, and as a result they are injured. So the Gemara says you are exempt midine adam. In other words, in a court of law, you cannot be found liable. But you are chai b'dinei shamayim. In other words, with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you're liable. So in other words, you see this interesting, the Gemara is just bringing this to back up the concept that we ended with yesterday, which is that when you create external stimuli which then result in someone else's damage, that is the person internalizing the stimuli and as a result being damaged. As such, I am not the damager. Now again, is there liability for such an act? So there is divine liability, or I should say liability with the divine, but there is no liability ultimately, again, in a court of law. Keitzad, the Gemara gives an example of this. Taka ba'azno v'charsho, pater. So for example, if somebody goes ahead, Reuven goes over to Shimon and makes a loud noise by Shimon's ear, and Shimon goes deaf, Reuven will not be chayiv. But on the other hand, if Reuven goes ahead and holds on to Shimon, right, literally again, holds on to him, and then goes ahead and makes a loud noise into his ear, then he will be chayiv. The fundamental distinction about whether or not you have hands on the person or not. So again, if there's no hands on the person, just external stimuli, then halacha l'maaseh, no liability. Hands on the person, then there is liability. Interesting halacha. Tanya idach, another brayso. Hari shahaisa eino kihuya. So another interesting. Now we're getting into more. Did I skip? Tanabanan. Hika inovikaso. So this is some interesting cases. So now back. Remember, we are still focusing ultimately again on the concept or on the topic ultimately of what type of injuries result in emancipation. So watch this. Tanabanan. Where it explains as follows. Hika al inovikasa. But listen to this case. Let's say master hits the eved on the eye. Hits the eved in the eye. But he doesn't blind the eye. Instead, what does he do? He diminishes sight. So he causes a loss of sight, but not blindness. Al shino v'nadda. Same thing. Master hits the eved in the mouth, right? It hits him in the tooth, and the tooth becomes loose. Right? So we'll say, so two cases of where there was an injury that was endured, but l'maisa, not blindness, right? Just diminution of sight. And ultimately, again, tooth is not knocked out, but ultimately it's shaky. So what's the halacha? Im yochel ishtamish poin achshav in evid yosef l'cherus. V'im lav evid yosef l'cherus. The Gemara says it's a very simple distinction. is the eye usable? Is the tooth usable? So if the eye is usable, in other words, if there is some level of meaningful sight, then the Eved does not go free. If the tooth can be used, I don't know, the Eved, could still eat, right, on that side of his mouth, then Lamaisa, the Eved does not go free. But if the eye is effectively rendered useless, and the tooth is rendered useless, even though the tooth is still there, and even though the eye technically has some amount of sight, ultimately, again, the Eved will go free. So I'll say, so this is interesting, because what this is saying over here is as follows. Up until now, we've been focusing on absolutes, right? The master knocks out a tooth. The master blinds an eye. Here, I'll say, what the Gemara is introducing us to is, even if the master didn't blind him, or didn't knock out the tooth, if the eye is no longer, quote-unquote, usable, right? It doesn't function in any meaningful way. The tooth doesn't function in any meaningful way. The Eved is emancipated through that as well. I just want to point out, because I had a great conversation with David Schwartz yesterday, so I just want to make sure that this is clear, which is, understand, all of this, right, what are these halachas designed to do? These halachas are designed to prevent mistreatment of avadim. Even though we've been focusing on the idea that an Eved Kanani is property, right? You are not permitted to mistreat your Eved. And if you do so, you are penalized. What's the penalty? You lose your Eved. He goes free. So just to point out, this is, so on one hand, we always speak about an Eved Kanani is like karka. He's like property. So I can do whatever I want with my karka. You can do it with your karka. Your Eved Kanani is a human being, and as such, there are laws which govern the way you interact with him. Okay, let's go back there. Tanya idach, another brisa. So he says, "Hare shahaisa eno keuya v'sama." So we'll say, listen to this brisa. What if the Eved already had diminished sight in one eye? In other words, that's the way he came to me. All right, as I bought the Eved, he already had diminished sight in one eye. Then what do? I end up punching him in the eye. By the way, also, when we have these images of punching him in the eye, we also have like these images of like a master beating up his Eved. The truth is, we're going to see that even in cases where it was unintentional, these same halachas apply. So I accidentally hit him in the eye, right? I accidentally injured him. So let's say this is an interesting case. Let's say now the Eved came into servitude with diminished sight in one eye, and then I injure him and blind him. Similarly again, Shino Neduda Vepilo. Similarly again, he had a loose tooth. And I knocked him in the mouth, and I knocked out the tooth. So we'll say, so what do we look at? If the eye was technically usable, right? If the eye was usable, then Einach Inami, again, he goes free. Right? Tooth was usable, he goes free. If the eye already was unusable, the tooth already, again, could not operate in its designed function, then halacha l'mais, the Eved does not go free. Good. So we'll say, so essentially what's interesting is you kind of have these two brises that are pretty much saying the same thing, which is, brisa number one was, I hit the Eved in the eye, and I diminish his sight. So what's the halacha? If there's any level of meaningful sight left, he doesn't go free. If there's no level of meaningful sight left, he does go free. Same thing with the tooth, right? Brisa number two was, Eved came into servitude with diminished sight. Now I injure his eye. So what's the halacha? If he had some level of vision before and lacks that now, he goes free. If he already didn't really have meaningful vision before, so I didn't change anything through the injury, he doesn't go free. So the brises are essentially saying the same thing. So Gemara says, I'll tell you why it's sricha. You need them both. Why? Had you just said the first brisa, mishum de meikar nehura bari vahashta nehura kechisha. In the first brisa, remember again, the Eved had complete sight, and then I injured him, causing diminished sight. Right? So maybe that's the case where ultimately there's the possibility of emancipation. But in brisa number two, the Eved already came in with diminished sight. So maybe in that situation, halacha l'maisa, there's no emancipation. Or I will say maybe again only mention the brisa where there was complete blindness. Aval hasam delo sami legamre emalo. But in the case where he didn't totally blind the Eved, even if he diminished his sight, maybe he shouldn't go free. Therefore, it's tzvicha. So we'll say ultimately again, I need both prices. But I will say what is incredibly interesting about this and actually fascinating about this is that halacha l'maisa, we're now introduced to just a new level of emancipation. So even if I don't knock out the eye, when I say knock out the eye, blind the eye or knock out the tooth, if I injure the Eved in such a way where the eye is effectively no longer usable, even if technically speaking, he has some sight, but it's not usable, or the tooth is still there, but it's so, wobbly, shaky, I don't know. Dr. Elman just walked in, so I don't know, it's got to be a technical lashon for a wobbly tooth. Or Dr. Lossman, I don't know, the dentist, no, you can get CME credits or something for this, answer this question. All right, he'll say, so l'maisa, whatever it is, so it's so wobbly that halacha l'maisa, it's not usable. So again, what you see over here is the Eved could go free if the master injures him in such a way that functionality of the limb has been lost. Incredible. So let's go weiter. So this is going to open the door to a whole new discussion. Tarabanan. Both said, listen to this case. This is incredible. Haya shahaya rabo rofe. Va'amarlo likchalo eno bisama. Lachterlo shino v'hepila. Both said, listen to this case. Imagine the master, right, is an ophthalmologist. Right? The master is an ophthalmologist. So what happens? So the Eved says, listen, master, my eye is really bothering me. Would you mind taking a look, right? Examining my eye. Applying, lichol literally means to apply like an eye ointment. Or the master is a dentist. And the Eved says, I'm having a terrible toothache. So what happens? The master will say, now here I just want to point out, this is a case of zero malicious intent. Like fakir, just the opposite. This is a case of the master trying to help. So the master treats the eye condition and ends up blinding the Eved. The master treats the tooth condition, right, and ends up knocking out the tooth. So what's the halacha, say? What's the halacha? Sichek ba'adon v'yatz l'cheros. The Eved laughs the whole way out the door. In other words, it means the Eved goes free. The Eved goes free. In other words, I will say, so what's interesting, so here what you see is that halacha l'maisa, even without any vestige, without any bit of intent of malice or intent to damage, if the master causes injury, the Eved goes free. And I will say this just highlights again how careful the Torah is trying to make the Adon with the care of the Eved. Incredible. Rabbi Shmuel says no. Rabbi Shmuel disagrees. He says v'shichasa ad she's kavin l'shachsa. Rabbi Shmuel disagrees. He says that is incorrect. That is incorrect. The only time an Eved goes free is when there is intent to damage. And that's because we'll say the lashon of the pasuk is v'shichasa, right? The master does something destructive to the Eved. But if the intent was to help, but the help ultimately again results in the loss of the eye, loss of the tooth, the Eved does not come. So both say it's a fundamental machlokes over here. Rabbanon, hay v'shichasa ma'avde. What did the Rabbanon do with the phrase of v'shichasa? So the Gemara says, Mibayle l'chidisanya. Rabbi Lazar Omer, hari shahoshit yado l'may shivchaso, v'sima uba sheveme'eha. So Rabbi said, this is an interesting case. Let's say the master is trying to help his maidservant give birth. In the course of helping the maidservant to give birth, he blinds the baby. Right? He's helping to try to deliver the baby. He blinds the baby. So Rabbi says, so what's the halacha? Potter. In that case, the master is potter. Why? My time of the amakra v'shichasa ad sheyechavin l'shachsa. So Rabbi says, so just to point out, what's there in that case and the case of where the master is trying to treat the eye ailment? There's a very big distinction. Rashi points out, in the case where the master is trying to treat the eye ailment, I would say he has kavana to do what? To deal with the eye. As opposed to the case where he's delivering the baby, where the damage is total. In other words, he has nothing to do. He's not aiming for the eye. He's trying to help deliver this baby. In the course of delivering the baby, he damages the eye. So that Rabbi Lazar will say, or that I should say, the Rabbanan will say, that's a case where there's no premeditated involvement with the eye. So that ultimately cannot cause the Eved to go free. So I'll say, so fundamental machlokes. So the Gemara says, V'idach, the other opinion will say, Mivashiches shachsa nafka. We'll learn that out from the fact that Vashichasa is written in the elongated form. V'idach, the other opinion will say, Shiches shachsa lo darish. She doesn't dash in the elongated form. So we'll say, so this is a dramatic machlokes, right? Again, so we'll say, see what's happening over here? So like, we're kind of like expanding this out. We begin with like a paradigmatic case where, I think in our mind's eye, what we imagine this case, like the pure case to be, is like the servant didn't perform what the master wanted. What did the master do? Punches him in the mouth, knocks out a tooth. Right? I don't know that that's the paradigmatic case. I think that's how we envision it. He goes free. So now, now we're expanding it. Right? What do we see? Even if you don't knock it out, but you diminish functionality to the point that it's no longer really a usable part of the body, goes free. Not only that. You're trying to help. You're a doctor, you're trying to help. We'll say, by the way, this is actually interesting, right? You have this concept in medicine, right? That if you're trying to help someone and ultimately, again, you cause damage, that is, at least from halacha, I know like in today's malpractice world, that's certainly not true, right? But at least in halacha, there is a concept like this, that a rofe, a doctor, is freed from liability if he is trying to help, as long as it's clear that he was not a posheya, right? If he was absolutely negligent, then there could be liability. But assuming the doctor was not negligent, even if something happened, he is freed from liability in halacha, because we want the doctor to treat people. And I will say that applies in every single case except Eved Kanani. Incredible. So you're the doctor, you're the master doctor working on your Eved. You knock out his tooth, you blind his eye. You are right. You did your job. You were in conformance with every single medical norm, but yet you cause this, goes free. I will say. So again, that's a machlokes, right? So the Rabbanan will say goes free. Rabbi Shimon Elazar says doesn't go free. I will say, I'll just point out over because this is a fascinating case. The Rambam, how do we paskin in this case? So let's say the master is actually treating the ailment of his Eved, and the Eved goes and he blinds him. What's Allah supposed to say? So the Rambam writes in Hilchos Avadim Perek Hey Halacha Hey Hari Shahaya Rabba Rofe Va'amar Lo Kicholi Einai V'Sima Chatro Lishnei Ve'Pila Sachak Ba'adam V'Yatza Lecheros Sha'af Api Shlo Niskavin Lahazik Hari Niskavin Lingoa Be'Evrei Eved. So we'll say the Rambam says, the Rambam paskins like the Rabbanon. Halacha L'Maisa, if you're the master, you're trying to treat the eye ailment, you're trying to treat the tooth ailment, and the eye is blinded, the tooth comes out, your Eved goes free. Why? Because you have kavana to get involved with the eye. You have kavana to get involved with the tooth. Even though there was no malicious intent, the Eved goes free. I contrast that with the case of the Eved the master trying to help his maidservant give birth and accidentally blinds the eye of the baby. That there's no emancipation there, because halacha l'maisa there was no kavana to deal with the eye, to deal with the tooth. Incredible. Let's go back to Amar Rav Sheshes. We'll say last three lines in the daf. When I say last three lines of the daf, yesterday's daf. Harei shahaisa. But listen to this. What happens if the Eved's eye was blind? Right? The Eved was already blind. Right? And the master knocked the eye out of the socket. Which is fascinating cases. So what's the halacha? Eved yotzei ben lecheres. The Eved goes free. The Eved goes free. So here, it's fascinating, right? So here, the eye already was non-functional. It was non-functional, but yet the Eved knocked the eye out of the socket. Sorry, the master knocked it out of the socket. Eved goes free. My time, muchusra everhu. Because Rabbi say again, now the Eved is missing a limb. Now he's considered missing. So remember again, this is also, remember this goes back to yesterday's daf. This was the distinction between tooth and eye, right? Tooth teaches us that if something is missing. Eye teaches us that if something ceases to function. So interestingly enough, if his eye was already blind, but now the master knocks it out of the socket, now he's muchusar aver. He's missing a limb. And missing a limb ultimately is grounds for emancipation. So the Gemara goes right there. My time V'tana tuna. We have a rice that supports this as well. Tamos v'zichros b'behema ve'in tamos zichros ba'ofos. So say the halacha by karbanos is that by behema you need the animal to be complete, i.e. unblemished, and ultimately again to be male. And these halachas don't apply by bird offerings, right? Bird offerings can be blemished. Bird offerings again are gender neutral. So yochol yavsha gapa nikta ragla nechtema ena. You might have thought therefore by a bird, therefore again if its wing dry, dried up, right, and fell off, or if wing was clipped off, or its leg was clipped off, right, or its eye was missing, that you could offer it up. Tan Rabbanon minha of v'lo kol ha'ov. So we'll say, even by birds, as much as it could be blemished, it can't be missing a part of the body. So you see from here, I will say that halacha l'maisa, even if something is not working, once it's missing, that is considered to be a heightened form of blemish. So too again, even if the Eved's eye was already blind, but now the master knocked it out, the Eved will go free. Another interesting case. Top of Chav Hey. Haisalo yaseres v'chatcha. Both say it's a great case. What happens if the Eved had an extra finger? He was born with 6 fingers on one hand. And now what did the master do? The master cut off the extra finger. See, but it's like, no harm, no foul, whatever. Now, whatever. Hey, what did he do? What did he do? So the Gemara says, Eved yotzei b'macheres. The Eved does go free. Why? Rav Huna v'hu shenisperes al gav hayad. That is assuming, by the way, that 6th finger, I don't know exactly how this works, but that 6th finger is along the same line, right? In other words, I will say, as opposed to, I guess, like a 6th finger that could just like jut out from a different part of the hand, the 6th finger is arranged with the rest of the fingers. So because of that, again, it's considered to be a part of the body. And halacha l'maisa, if the master cuts it off, that would be grounds ultimately for emancipation. And I will say, that is how the Rambam paskins. Interesting. Okay, let's go back there. Sabi Dinazayin, both say great case. Sabi, all great cases. Whoever thought, I will say, no, tell me this is not an exciting sugya. As somebody would have told you, Eved Kanani is going to be fantastic, you'd be say, sure. But now, Baruch Hashem. All right, Sabi Dinuzayno, Dinuzanyo. The elders of Nuzanyo, that's a place. They didn't come to Rav Chisda shir. Rav Chisda was very offended. Amar le Rav Hamnuna zil san inhu. Go essentially put them in cherem. So this is a good argument to come to shir, by the way. We're going to start utilizing this. There's a lot of lessons in this. First of all, number one, rabbis have feelings too, right? That's right. They didn't show up in shir. He was very offended. We'll say, now obviously this wasn't just anyone. This was the elders of the city. So the truth is, when the elders of the city don't show up to the shir, it looks to a certain degree like a little bit of like a lack of allegiance, which depending on the leadership model in the city could ultimately be not so good for the running of the city. In any event, Rav Chisda obviously had his logic. He went to Rav Nuna. He said literally again, put them in cherem. Azul Amar Lahu. So Rav Hamnuna goes to the elders. So before he puts them in cherem, he says, let me try to understand what's going on over here. Amar Lahu, my time alo asra b'na lepirga. So Rav Hamnuna says to the elders, why didn't you come to Rav Chisda's shir? So Amrulay, they said to him, Amai Nesi, why should we go to a shir? We ask him questions and he doesn't answer us. Wow. So I said, why should we come to shir? In other words, essentially we have nothing to learn. Right? We ask questions, doesn't answer. Amrullahu, mi ba'isu minai midi. So it was an interesting exchange here. So Rav Hamnuna says, tell me, have you ever asked me a question and I haven't answered it? So it's interesting what exactly Rav Hamnuna is saying over here. So it could be just from this exchange, Rav Hamnuna was kind of like Rav Chisda's right-hand man. So again, Rav Hamnuna says to the elders, look, you asked Rav Chisda, but you could also ask me. Asking me is like asking Rav Chisda. So fine, they said, fine, we'll ask you. So ba'minei, Evet shesir surabo bebeitzim mahu. So they asked him the following question, right? They asked him, what happens, Rabbi say, if ultimately, again, the master castrates the Evet? Right? So I was like, can you imagine, like, if you're Rav Hamnuna, you're like, whoa, I was not expecting that one. Right? So again, so the master goes in and castrates the Eved. So we'll say, Mahu. Now what's the shaila? This is very interesting. Mahu. Kimum galoi dami olo. Is this, like Nabo say, going back to yesterday's daf, what's the criteria ultimately, again, for going free? Number one, it has to be a visible injury that doesn't regenerate. So I will say castration. Now here, he's dafka referring to the cutting off of the testicles. Is that called a mum galui or not? And I will say, now what's the shayla? This is fascinating. It's actually really interesting. So it actually points out, well again, are the beitzim, are the testicles, a visible part of the body? Well, on one hand, they're encased in the scrotum, right? So you can't see them per se, right? So they're not like visible, but at the end of the day, you know that they're there, right? So that's the shaila. Is that called a mum galoi or not? So poor Rav Hamnuna, he's like, you want to ask me something on kashrus maybe, like on Hilchos Shabbos, he's like, sorry, not prepared with that one. So so they said to Rav Hamnuna, Mashmecha, what's your name? Amr lahu Hamnuna. He said, my name is Hamnuna. Amrulei lav Hamnuna ela Karnuna. Your name is not Hamnuna, rather your name is Karnuna. I both say Karnuna is a lashon of a karen. A karen is a corner. So they say your name is not Hamnuna, your name is Karnuna. Karnuna refers to guys who spend their lives like sitting in the corners, right? Sitting in the corners. Listen, I remember when I was in YU. I remember this in Washington Heights. You used to have these guys who the whole day they were just sitting on overturned milk cartons, with like a cushion on it, and they were just like playing cards. Like it didn't matter what time of the day you went out, they were always there. That's Karnuna. That's Karnuna, right? They're just always just sitting around. So they give it. So these guys, obviously, again, these Rabbanim were obviously pretty intense guys. So they say to Rav Hamnuna, your name is not Hamnuna, your name is Karnuna. Your name is Karnuna. Okay. So we'll say, all right, that is the end of that exchange. So now the problem is Rav Hamnuna himself is curious about this. What is the halacha of siros if a master castrates his avadim? So listen to this. So he came before Rav Chisda. So now Rav Hamnuna comes back to Rav Chisda, and he says, "This was the question they asked me, and what do you think?" So Rav Chisda said, "Listen, the truth is, it's a Mishnah. It's a Mishnah. And by the way, I will say, this is Rav Chisda's way of also telling Rav Hamnuna, do you know why they answered you so sharply? Is because the truth is, the answer to this question is really found in a Mishnah, and you got to know your Mishnayos. You got to know your Mishnayos. So Disnan, listen to this. Esrim v'arba rashe ivarim sheba adam. So we'll say. So remember again. You remember in yesterday's daf, the whole time we were quoting this list of 24 parts of the body. That if the master cuts it off of the eved, ultimately the eved goes free. So where is that list of 24? Here it is. But interestingly enough, as we're going to see, it's actually not. It's not mentioned by Avadim, it's mentioned in a different context. Here we go. Esim v'arba rashe ivarim sheba adam. So we'll say there are 24 parts. Now rashe ivarim literally means like the tips of parts of the body. Right? Rashe ivarim sheba adam. Kulam emitam mishum michya. Ultimately, again, they don't become tummy because of michya. We'll say, what's michya? A lot happening in today's daf. We'll say, so remember again, we have a concept of saras. Certain forms of saras are only actually interesting, are only problematic if in the middle of the tsaras you have like the appearance of healthy flesh. That's called a michya. A michya is that type of tsaras where you have the tsaras and then in the middle you have the healthy flesh. So I will say, so now the Gemara says there are 24 parts of the body where if you have a michya, if you have the healthy flesh on it, it doesn't become tsaras. Why not? The Elohim, I will say, I just want to tell you why this is. Let me just tell you why this is. Because these tips of the body, I will say, because they slope in different directions, you cannot see the whole body part at once. So I'll say, if you think about it, by the way, like if you go ahead and you look at the tip of your finger, interestingly enough, you really can't fully see all sides of your finger at once, right? If you look at this, so you only see one side. Look at this. Even if you look down, you can't fully see everything that's happening on the sides. So it's interesting. So therefore, we're going to see that for michya, for that type of tsaras, the pasuk says you have to be able to see the entire nega, right, the entire blemish, all at once. So therefore, if it turns out that it's on any one of the 24 tips of the body, it's not michya. So the Gemara says, what are they? Let's say here they are. Here is the list. Ve'eluhem. Rashi etzbos. 10 tips of fingers. Rashi etzbos yadayim v'raglayim. So we'll say literally again 10 fingers, 10 toes. V'rashi aznayim. Literally again the tops of the ear. Although we're going to see it doesn't have to be the top of the ear. Really, what it means is like any part of the ear. Rashi aznayim. V'rosh hachotem. The tip of the nose. V'rosh hagvia. We'll say rosh hagvia is the makom milah. The makom milah. V'rashi dadayim shebi isha. And ultimately again, the tips of the breast, the nipples, ultimately again also are part of the Evarim. Rabbi Huda Omer, af sheba ish. Rabbi says not just by a woman, it's by a man as well. The Tani Allah, And we learned about this. So we'll say, so again, I just want to point out, this list, interestingly enough, is by Avadim, right? Sorry, this list is by Tzaras. That's what this list is. V'tani Allah v'kulam eved yotze bahem lachirus. The Gemara says, this is incredible. It's just fascinating that this whole, everything we've been learning up until now really comes from Tzaras. Now the Gemara says, all of this applies to an eved. Fine. Rabbi Omer af sirus. Here we go. Rabbi adds in even castration. Right? Now, I just want to point out also, when it comes to castration, this is just good to know in general, right? When it comes to castration, from when the Gemara talks about sirus, we're going to see there's different types of sirus. There's what's called sirus de gid and sirus de beitzim. Sirus de gid means like a cutting off of the aver, of like the member, right? And ultimately, again, sirus de beitzim is a removal of the testicles. So we'll qualify our terms and just, you're like, I was not expecting this morning, right? I need another cup of coffee for this. Right? So I'll say, so watch this. So the Gemara says as follows. So the Gemara says, V'tani, so Rebbe adds in even castration. Rebbe adds in castrations, Ben Azai Omer Af Haloshin. But I'll say first why Lana Chaf He Medalef. Ben Azai adds in even the tongue. Interesting, even the tongue. Omer Mar, Rebbe Omer Af Asirus. So I'll say now Rebbe says even castration. Sirus Demai. So here we go. Castration of what? If we're talking about actually like the cutting off of the member, so then halacha lamaisa hainu gvia. So we'll say that falls into the category of the tip, which again we already established, right? The makomila, right? Which is one of the areas. Elalav sirus the beitzim. Rather, it has to be referring to castration of the testicles. Rebbe Omer. So we'll say, so therefore again, so just to kind of circle back over here, so Rav Chisda says back to Rav Hamnuna, that question they asked of you as to whether or not sirus, does an eved go free with sirus, it's a pretty explicit answer, that the answer is yes. That the answer is, at least according to Rebbe, the answer is absolutely yes. And halacha l'maisa, sirus the beitzim, castration of the testicles, would cause the evet to go free. The Rebbe, so the Gemara says, Rebbe lashon lo, Rebbe doesn't agree that cutting off of the tongue would cause an evet to go free. Or minhu, raise a kasha. What's the kasha? Misha hayamazev nisahazal piv. So we'll say this is such an interesting case. Totally switching gears. Someone is tameh to masmeis. And what's happening? The Kohen is sprinkling the waters of the para aduma on the individual. And the water lands on his mouth. The water lands on his mouth. So what's the halacha? Rebbe Omer Hiza. Rebbe says the sprinkling is good. V'chachamim omrim lo hiza. The Chum say it's not good. My love alashona. Are we not talking about again on the tongue? And you see from here that Rebbe says that the tongue is considered to be like an exposed part of the body. Lo al svasav. No, it's talking about his lips. So al svasav pshita. I don't understand. If it lands on his lips, why would anyone say that it's not a good sprinkling? Ma'adatemo oju. I've thought zimnin the chalim siv say. Sometimes Rebbe will say a person. What's the lashon? You know, when you press your lips together. Purse your lips, right? You purse your lips together so tight that sometimes, again, the lips could almost become like an interior part of the body. And therefore, I might have thought that the lips aren't considered like the exterior, but rather considered to be like the interior. And therefore, sprinkling should not work. To which the Gemara says, Kamash Malon, then no. Now, what I want to point out over here is just an important fact. Rashi points this out, but I'm just going to say it outside because of time. So remember again, for the sprinkling of the para aduma to work on the individual, it has to fall on his body, on an exposed part of his body. So now the Gemara is suggesting over here that we're talking about it falls on his lips. So what would be wrong with his lips? I might have thought that sometimes since a person purses his lips, the lips are considered to be like an interior part of the body, not like an exterior part of the body. And therefore, if the water falls on the lips, it won't be good. Kamash malon, no. Aiva Tanya, but we learned al shono. But that's not what the Brisa says. The Brisa talks about, again, the waters of the part of them falling on his tongue. V'o Tanya, furthermore, we learned v'shenitel rov haloshen. And I will say an additional blemish or an additional injury which would cause the evet to go free is if the majority of the tongue was removed. Rabbi Omer Rov Hamedaber Shebelashono. Ultimately, again, Rabbi says even the majority of the speaking part of the tongue. And I will say the speaking part of the tongue, the Gemara understands over here to refer to the part of the tongue that is attached to the body. So the Gemara says Va'od. Good. Ella, Rebbe, Sirus, V'lomi by Lashon. Rather, we have to say like this. Rebbe holds that castration of the testicles, and of course it goes without saying, removal of part of the tongue, are reasons for emancipation. Right, Rebbe includes both. Ben Azai Omer Lashon Aval Siruslo. Ben Azai says, I agree with removal of the tongue. Right, if the master cuts off part of the Eved's tongue, the Eved goes free. But I disagree with castration. Castration is not going to be a reason to let him go free. Umay af. So what does the word af mean? Akamaisa. Ihachi nikdama de Ben Azai bereisha. If that's the case, then put Ben Azai's statement first. Tana shamala de Rebbe v'kava, shamala de Ben Azai v'tani umishtal zazmim kama. So we'll say the Tana ultimately just recorded the opinions, ultimately as he heard them. Say Rabbi say what we are left with over here is as follows: the fundamental machlokes in Ben Azai and Rebbe. Rebbe holds Rabbi say that castration is grounds for emancipation. Right, so according to Rebbe, castration would satisfy the criteria. Number one, mumsha begaloi, right, a visible injury, and again, it doesn't regenerate. Same thing with the tongue. Ben Azai agrees with the tongue, ultimately again rejects castration. Amr Ula says, Hakol modin le'inyan tuma, belashon le'inyan tuma degaluihu, eitz al sheretz, my taima, asher yigabo amarachmana, v'hai nami bar nigiyahu. So we'll say, interesting here. So what happens? So Ula says, everyone agrees that when it comes to tuma, ultimately, again, the tongue is considered to be a revealed part of the body. Take a quick look at Rashi, Le'inyan Tuma. I will say it's Rashi in the wide lines, about 6 lines in Le'inyan Tuma. Tekaimulan maga beis hastarim eino metame, v'nafka b'mesechas nida mivakala sheyiga bo'azav. V'hai shatav, so listen to this halacha. The halacha is when it comes to halachas of Tuma, a person can only become tameh if the tummy item touches a revealed part of the body. But if the tummy item touches a hidden, quote-unquote, hidden part of the body, unrevealed part of the body, then ultimately, again, I'll give you an example of this, we'll say. Apologize in advance for the example. If somebody were to take a dead sheretz and to put it in your mouth, right, to put it in your mouth, and it wouldn't touch any outer part of the body. It would just go right into your mouth, right? Touch, let's say, the interior of your cheek. You would not become tameh with that. Now, what Ula is introducing, Rabbi say, is what happens if the dead sheretz or some other type of tumah touches your tongue, right? What's the halacha with the tongue? So the tongue is considered to be an exterior, visible part of the body. That's the chap, le'inyan tumah. My time, what's the reason? Because the Torah says when it comes to tumah says asher yigaba, that ultimately what becomes tummy, anything that the tummy item could touch, ultimately becomes tameh, and ultimately again the tongue could touch things outside of the body. So now listen to this. Le'inyan tvila, however, when it comes to an immersion in the mikvah, kitamun dami. Ultimately, again, I will say, then it is considered to be like a hidden part of the body. Now, I will say, now what does that mean, like a hidden part of the body? So remember, again, the halacha by tvila is that the water need not touch the interior or hidden parts of the body. The water only needs to touch, ultimately, again, the external parts of the body. Therefore, when immersing, the mikvah waters need not touch my tongue. Okay? My taima, v'rachatz b'sara b'mayim amrachmana. So the Torah says you shall immerse your flesh in the water. Ma b'sara me'avroi, af kol me'avroi. Just like the flesh is on the outside, so too the water only has to touch parts of the body that are on the outside as well. So they both say, so isn't this fascinating? So everyone will agree that when it comes to tumah, the tongue is considered to be like an exterior visible part of the body. Therefore, if the tongue comes in contact with a davar tameh, the body becomes tameh, the person becomes tameh. But for tvila, for immersion purposes, the tongue is considered to be like an interior part of the body. Therefore, the water does not have to come in contact with it. Lo nechlaku ela inyan hazah. The only way I say, what's the machlokes? The machlokes is when you sprinkle the waters of the para aduma. What is the status of the tongue? In other words, we'll say specifically, what happens if, when sprinkling the waters, the water only lands on the tongue, on the person who is tameh? Does that affect tara or not? Rebbe midami leilatuma. Rebbe compares the tongue, right? Rebbe compares the case of paraduma to tuma, and just like by tuma, the tongue is considered to be an exposed part of the body. So too, if the water falls on the tongue, that's a proper azah. For Rabbanan midami lula tefila, the Rabbanan ultimately again compared the tongue for paraduma to tefila purposes, and just like by immersion purposes, the tongue is considered to be an interior part of the body. So too for paraduma, the tongue is an interior part of the body, and therefore if the waters of the paraduma fall on the tongue, ultimately again it is not an effective sprinkling. V'tarvaihu b'hai kraka miflagin. I will say both Rebbe Both Rebbe, ultimate, and the Rabbanan are arguing the following pasuk. The pasuk says, "V'hiza atar latame." So Rebbe Savar, Rebbe says, here's how you have to read the pasuk: "V'hiza hatar alatame b'yom hashlishi, u'b'yom hashvi v'chit'o." Literally, again, the person who's tahar will sprinkle on the person who is tameh on the third day and on the seventh day, and ultimately, again, will purify him. So, according to Rebbe, the act of purification is compared to the tumah. It's compared to the tumah. Just like when it comes to tumah, the tongue is considered to be an exposed part of the body. So too, by para aduma, the tongue is considered to be an exposed part of the body, and therefore, if the water lands on the tongue, that is an effective sprinkling. Rabbanan, so the Gemara says, good. Rabbanan savri v'chit'o b'yom hashvi v'chibeis b'gadav v'rachatz b'mayim. So we'll say they just placed the comma in the pasuk in a different place. So the Rabbanan read is, you shall become purified on the seventh day. You shall launder your clothing and immerse yourself in the water. So what do you see from here? The Torah compares paraduma to immersion in the mikvah, and just like by immersion in the mikvah, the tongue is considered to be an interior part of the body. So too, ultimately, again, for paraduma, the tongue is considered to be an interior part of the body as well. And therefore, if the waters of the paraduma were to land on the tongue, that would be an ineffective sprinkling. For Rabbana nami nedami l'tumah. So both say, so why don't the Rabbana also compare it to tumah? Tara mitara havarei lamel. If it makes more sense to go ahead and compare tara to tara. The Rebbe nedami l'tvila. Why doesn't Rebbe compare it to immersion? The chibeis begadav hefsekayin. That phrase the chibeis begadav ultimately again goes ahead and interrupts. So Rabbi says, so here's what we have so far. We have what we have so far. So we'll say it's fascinating. How do we get into this? We're just trying to figure out if the master cuts off a piece of the Eved's tongue, does he go free or not? Rabbi say, what does that fundamentally depend on? Is the tongue considered to be a visible part of the body or not? Because remember again, the only time an Eved goes free is if halacha l'maisa and the master injures him in a part of the body that's visible and doesn't regenerate. So is the tongue considered to be a visible part of the body? So it turns out, Rabbi said that what? That really the status of the tongue is subject to machlokes. See, here's what we know. Here's what everybody agrees on. When it comes to tumah, the tongue is considered to be like an exposed part of the body. And therefore, if the tongue comes in contact with a davar hatameh, the person becomes tameh. When it comes to immersion in the mikvah, the tongue is considered to be like what? An interior part of the body. Therefore, the water need not come in contact with the tongue. What's the machlokes case? Machlokes case, para aduma. What happens if the person who's tameh is getting sprinkled by the kohen and the waters of the para aduma land on the tongue? So that's a machlokes Rebbe and the Rabbanan. Rebbe will say ultimately again that it works because he compares para aduma to tumah. The Rabbanan will say it doesn't work because they compare para aduma to tvila. Fascinating. So the Gemara says, one second. The Gemara says, good. Is that true that Rebbe holds that when it comes to immersion in the mikvah, that the tongue is considered to be like an interior part of the body? Listen to this case. There was once an episode of a shifcha maidservant in the house of Rebbe. Shetavla, she went to the mikvah. I will say now, why would the shifcha be going to the mikvah? We'll say, because remember again, if the shifcha is going to be eating truma, which she is entitled to, or the shifcha is going to be eating Karam Pesach, she has to be ritually pure. Right? So the shifcha is going to the mikvah. She's going to the mikvah. What happens? And when she came out, she came out of the mikvah, the nimtza etzem bein shineh. She found like a bone in between her teeth. And Rabbi say, what happened? Rabbi required her to do another immersion. Why, Rabbi say? Because it was a chatzitza. A chatzitza, ultimately, again, right, there was an interposition. There was something in her mouth. So what do you see from here? That the items inside the mouth, ultimately, again, are not considered to be like interior spaces. Remember again, because if the mouth and the tongue were really interior spaces, then what? Any chatzitza, right, any interposition in there shouldn't matter. The fact that he required a second immersion indicates to us that in fact, for immersion purposes, the mouth and by extension the tongue are considered to be like exterior spaces. To which the Gemara says, no. You're right. Really, the mouth, the tongue are interior spaces, and therefore they do not require the water to enter. However, makom haray lavo b'mayim ba'inan. But the halacha is the interior of the mouth has to be fit for water entry. Right? And this is, by the way, this is how he passes in halacha l'maisa. Right? When a woman or anyone goes to the mikvah, you don't have to open your mouth in the mikvah. Right? Depending on which mikvah you use, that is very important. Right? So l'maisa again, right? You don't have to go ahead. You don't have to open your mouth, right, when you go into the mikvah. But the interior of the mouth has to be roi, has to be fit. If the water were to come there, that there would be no problem. So that's why there can't be any type of chatzitza. And that's the Gemara is just saying it's a different technicality. Kid Rabbi Zera, Don Rabbi Zera, kalaroi lebila in bila ma'akev. So we'll say about karban mincha. We've seen this phrase many times. Karban mincha, there's a halacha that you're supposed to go ahead and mix the mincha. Right? You have flour, you have oil, you have levona. So you have to mix everything. What if you didn't mix everything? The karban mincha is kosher, but it has to be fit for mixing. So something that is fit for mixing, even if you didn't mix it, ultimately again, it's fine. Rabbi say, but if halacha l'maisa you have a karban mincha that is not fit for mixing. Rabbi say, when would the karban mincha not be fit for mixing? If you piled too much mincha into the klisharis, into the bowl, so that if you were to mix it, everything were to pour over the side, that's a karban mincha that's not fit for mixing. So what's the halacha there? Ultimately, again, ma'akev espo. Rabbi say, so therefore, again, what the Gemara suggests over here is that halacha l'maisa, this whole idea about the interior of the mouth being ready for water is a totally separate halacha. We are still in our pre-established categories that for immersion purposes, everyone is agreeing that the tongue is considered to be like the interior part of the mouth. For tumah purposes, everyone is agreeing that the tongue ultimately, again, is considered to be like an external part of the body. The machlokes is by paraduma, to which the Gemara says, kitanoi. Now remember again, the tongue is actually not our kaf hema base, 25b, top line. So just to point out, remember, the tongue is actually not our primary discussion over here. What is our primary discussion over here? Castration, right? It's all about castration. So we'll say, so Lamaising, and that's how we got into this. Like, is that considered to be the type of injury that would cause the eved to go free? To which the Gemara says, kitanoi. In reality, it's a machlokes. And I both say, what does it all hinge on? What does it all hinge on? It all hinges on is castration considered to be a visible injury or not? That's the shaila. Is it a visible injury or not? So the Gemara says, "K'tenai umoch v'kasos v'nasak v'karos." So I will say over here, the Gemara quoting the pasuk about an animal. That if you have an animal that has squashed testicles, crushed testicles, nasuk removed, karos cut off, this is the type of animal you cannot offer up as a karban. So kulan bebeitzin Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says these are all conditions or all states regarding the testicles. So velo begid, and not talking about again the actual gid, the actual member itself. Ella, I'm sorry, the Rabbi Yehuda. So the Rabbi Yehuda, bebeitzin velo begid. Ella, so bebeitzin velo begid, it only applies to the beitzin and not the gid. Ella kulan af bebeitzin the Rabbi Yehuda. So most Rabbi Yehuda holds these states, right, all apply to both the beitzim and the gid. Rabbi Lazar ben Yaakov Omer kulam begid. Rabbi Yaakov says no, it only applies to the gid, only to the male member. Rabbi Yossi Omer mo'och v'kasos af bebeitzim v'nasak v'karos begid. Right, begid in bebeitzim lo. So we'll say what you see from here over here, from the Gemara is discussing by the karban. There's a machlokes. What applies to the beitzim? What applies to the gid? The Gemara wants to suggest this same machlokes would apply ultimately again to eved kanani. So I will say. So bottom line, what it comes down to is halacha l'maisa. Castration will remain ultimately a machlokes tanoim. If a master goes ahead and castrates his eved, does the eved go free? Machlokes tanoim. Both say, what's the machlokes about? Is castration considered to be a mum galui or not? We're going to come back to this. We're going to see the Rambam on this. Right now, let's just do the Mishnah. Here we go. Behema Gaspa said, totally switching gears now. We've spoken about how to acquire an eved ivri. We've spoken about how to acquire an eved kinani. Now the Gemara totally switches gears. Behema gasa niknis b'mesira. Behema gasa, we'll say a large animal can be acquired with mesira. We'll say, what is the act of mesira? Rashi says over here, Ba'ala mosrim osa l'lokeach ba'afsar o b'sara. We'll say the kinyan of mesira means, let's say I want to purchase an animal from Ruvain, so ultimately there's a behema gasa, a large animal. Ruvain gives me over the reins, he literally hands me the reins, right? Or afsar is the halter, right? The halter, the reins, or the sar, or I take hold of the hair of the animal. That's called Mesira. So a large animal is acquired by Mesira, V'hadaka b'hagba, Div Rabbi Meir, and a small animal, Hagba. So we'll say Rabbi Meir holds large animals conveyed by Mesira, ultimately against small animals, Hagba, lifting up. That's Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Eliezer. V'cham say no, Behemadaka niknis b'meshicha. Ultimately, again, a behemadaka, a small animal is not acquired by Hagba, rather a small animal is acquired by Meshicha. We'll say now, what's Meshicha? Meshicha is really the act of causing the animal to move from one domain to another. It could be either you pulling the animal, it could also be you calling the animal and the animal coming, or it could be like giving the animal a little zetz, causing the animal to move. So we'll say three different kinyanim mentioned over here. Right? So according to Rabbi Meir, a behema gasa, ultimately Mesira, you hand over the reins, hand over the halter, let the buyer take hold of the hair. Small animal, ultimately Akbar, lifting it up. That's Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Lazar. Chum say, behema daka, small animal, Meshicha. Again, you have to cause that animal to move from one domain to another. Right? So we'll say, we'll have to stop over here for today. Okay, we'll have a lot to do in Miras Hashem. For tomorrow, we'll catch up. We'll catch up tomorrow. We'll say, what a day, right? What a sugya, what a gemara. Miras Hashem. More on Behem Bagasa and Medaka tomorrow. Shkoyach. All right, Chevron Zoom, have a great day, everyone. Good morning, Michael.